Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation Monitoring webinar on Indicators 8 and 10. My name is Anna Whitson. I'm joined here in New York by my colleagues Yuko and Liz here from the UNDP side of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Joint Support Team. We also have our colleague Samina here from UN Women. We have our colleagues from the OECD side online who you can see. The OECD side of the Joint Support Team, we have Alejandro, Nathan, and Sabele in Paris. So today we're going to cover indicators 8 and 10 in a session, hopefully lasting about 1 hour to 90 minutes. So we'll have short presentations from our colleagues here, followed by a lot of time for an interactive Q&A session. So just a couple of housekeeping items before we start. To cut down on the feedback noise, we've actually muted everyone. So if you have a question at any time, you can do one of two things. So the first thing would be to hit the raise hand button, and we can go ahead and just unmute you individually. You can also type your question out in the question box on the toolbar. So we'll be monitoring those throughout, and we'll pause in between the presentations just to cover any of those questions that are coming in. So we're also recording this session, and we'll be making it available to download early next week after the conclusion of the webinar series. So at that time is when we'll circulate all the PowerPoints for the series, as well as a link to all the monitoring documents, which are actually now housed on our Global Partnership community space, which is unteamworks.org/GPEDC. So if you'd like a copy of today's presentation before we circulate next week, we'll be uploading it in the handouts link on the toolbar very shortly, and that should be available within the next 5 to 10 minutes. So with that, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Yuko Suzuki here on the UNDP side of the Joint Support Team, who's going to begin the presentation with a little bit of background on the monitoring process. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand over to Yuko.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much for everybody being available for this webinar. Some of you might have already been in the other webinars, but we wanted to just recap in terms of what is the monitoring approach and what is the Global Partnership Monitoring Framework and what are the kind of indicators that we are looking at. So broadly, the Global Partnership Monitoring approach, as it is the case for the Global Partnership itself, uses the global light country focus approach. And what it means is that the monitoring is undertaken under the country leadership, and the data collections and validations that is needed for the monitoring of some of the indicators are actually led by developing country governments in consultation with development partners, including the providers, civil society organizations, private sector parliaments, and so on. And the country sort of data collection validation is to be also grounded in existing national processes when possible, meaning that some of the country that has an aid information management system might be using the system to collect the data and validate through the dialogue or the coordination framework that might already exist in country, such as the development partner coordination group or the development partner groups or any sort of dialogue mechanisms that might be in place at the country level. And then in essence, by doing the monitoring under the country leadership, meaning that we really want the monitoring process to strengthen the process at the country level, and the monitoring process itself to really spark the multi-stakeholder dialogue and accountability on effective development cooperation issues. With regard to the global light approach, the global coordination is managed through the OECD UNDP Joint Support Team, and it coordinates the aggregations and analysis of the existing data that will be submitted from the country monitoring processes, as well as globally sourced data, and provides continuous support to countries through operational guidance. As you might have already seen that there is a 2015 monitoring guide that is available, and also through a regular help desk functions that we provide. And at the end of the day, the Global Partnership OECD UNDP Joint Support Team will produce the Global Progress Report to inform the ministerial level meeting that's coming up in Nairobi towards the end of 2016. The next slide looks at what is actually being monitored under the Global Partnership Monitoring Framework. Just to recap, that the current monitoring framework, in terms of its indicators, targets, and process to monitor progress up to 2015, had been agreed in 2012 through the last meeting of the Working Party on the aid effectiveness, and then that is the culmination of an extensive consultations and discussion that was held through the Post-Busan Interior Group. And it focuses on the implementation of the principles of effective development cooperation through selective 10 indicators. And that 10 indicators are actually shown in this slide. As you can see, some of the indicators are drawing from the Paris Declaration indicators, and those indicators are given because of the strong country demands and a good track record of monitoring those indicators. And there was also a new Busan indicator that had been introduced in this global partnership monitoring framework. And that includes the gender indicator that we will be discussing today. And in terms of the aid untied, the indicator that we will be also covering today is one of those indicators that have been monitored since 2005. I'll go to the next slide. A little more details in terms of what are those indicators. But I wouldn't actually go into too much detail on the specific indicators. But this is just to indicate what are the indicators that are actually monitored, the data being collected at the country level, and what are the global source data that will be informing the indicators. As you can see, the indicator 8, the gender equality women's empowerment, is at the country level, so that the process of the monitoring happens at the country level. The information and data to inform the assessment of that is generated and collected at the country level. The 8 being untied, the indicator 10, this is coming from the global source data through the OECD DAC, and that it's basically in terms of what I want to highlight in this particular slide. The next slide that looks at the key steps and timeline for the second monitoring round. As you may know that the monitoring round, the second round itself had been launched in September. And before that, through the joint support team and together with the steering committees and co-chairs and stakeholders, there have been quite a lot of preparations and sensitization with regard to the upcoming second round monitoring. And from the September to the October and October now to October, since October up to now, many countries are already starting or implementing the monitoring exercise at the country level. To support that process through the joint support team, together with some of the regional organizations and institutions, we also organize a series of regional monitoring workshops that happens in the month of September, October, and November. Here, I just want to highlight that the key deadline for this country-level monitoring is 31st of March. That is the time that the country coordinator, the national focal points, will be submitting the validated data to the OECD UNDP Joint Support Team. It's also quite important to highlight that this process of the data collections and validations that will require data submissions from the providers or the different stakeholders, and that needs to be also validated at the country level. So once the data is submitted to the OECD UNDP Joint Support Team, we consider those data have already been validated from the providers through the different stakeholder consultation or discussions. Then April, May, we will do the processing and the final reviews, and the data is being aggregated and analyzed, and the report will be produced in the month of June to September, and the publications of that report inform the future discussion or the further discussions or the consultations through the regional as well as the different stakeholder consultation that might be organized as a preparatory process to the second high-level meeting that will be taking place in Kenya at the end of November or the beginning of December. The next slide is just indicating what are the roles and responsibility with regard to different stakeholders in the country monitoring processes. As I said, the monitoring process is a country-led, meaning that developing country governments would appoint a national coordinator who will be leading and managing the country-level monitoring process. And it's typically the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of Planning or Ministry of Foreign Affairs, depending on the country context with regard to which ministry has an overall responsibility for managing development cooperation. And that the national coordinators will be then working very closely with the relevant government institutions to support and manage the process. In the case of the gender equality, we will be having more discussions in terms of the process, but the national coordinator will be working very closely with the relevant units or the ministry that are in charge of the gender equality, and in terms of some of the elements of the gender budgeting within the institutional setup that the government has, that each country has. In terms of the provider country offices, some of the countries have already appointed a provider focal point in consultation with the national coordinators and the other provider country offices. And they will be playing a key role in terms of being a main sort of interlocutor in terms of the management of the process and supporting the national coordinator on the side of the government. But for each country office, we have also requested a focal point that in order to make the monitoring process much more easier to manage and facilitate it. So these focal points in each of the country office will be liaising with their headquarters in terms of the data submissions, data validations, and so on. And they will be playing a major sort of counterpart role in relation to the national coordinator with regard to the monitoring exercise. And with regard to that focal point, one focal point, a provider focal point that might be appointed as a main interlocutor, some of the country have appointed the UN focal points or the UNDP focal points to play that role, but some other country had also appointed different focal points from the different providers' office, depending on the country coordination mechanisms that might be in place. The other partners, such as parliamentarians, CSOs, and private sectors and trade unions, also play a major role in being the main counterparts in engaging in discussions, engaging the data submissions as well as the validation. And for that, from the Global Partnership Joint Support Team, we have also worked with some of those global networks to identify some of the focal points at the country level to inform the national coordinator as to who they could be relying on in terms of the managing the monitoring process. I wouldn't go too much in details in terms of the joint support team's role, but just to inform that the team sits in Paris as well as New York, that plays the global coordination's role and providing help desk functions to the country monitoring processes. The next slide is the reporting data, just to indicate who is providing data for each of the indicator. And as you see, these are only the indicators that are collected at the country level, the data are collected at the country level. I think this is quite straightforward in terms of the matrix, so I wouldn't go too much details on that, but just to highlight for the gender equality, women's empowerment, this is the monitoring indicator that is monitored through the country level process. The data might be submitted from the government institutions, and then such a data is the qualitative information. But again, is to highlight that data collections and the validation process, we encourage the multi-stakeholder discussions in terms of the validations and the conversation around that. I wouldn't actually also go too much in details, and then you will have the presentations that is available through our systems. So you could also see a little more in details as to who will be providing what kind of information. The government, in this case for the gender equality indicator, it provides the data and it also facilitates the dialogue around the monitoring results. Okay, so that's it in terms of the recap of the broader monitoring processes, and I would like now take the request Samina from UN Women to actually go through the gender equality women's empowerment indicator.
Thank you. Thank you, Yoko, and thank you for the joint support team for inviting UN Women for this webinar. I'll just start with some, brief definitions of what was brief definitions and some background on what the gender equality indicator is all about and where does that it does come from. As you can see from the first slide, that the indicator itself is basically measuring percentage of countries they have put in place systems to track gender equality allocations, and also systems which actually make those allocations public. So the indicator basically is looking at two aspects, the accountability part and the transparency of public spending. It seems a very technical indicator, so we had to provide some definitions when we were developing the methodology for the first round of monitoring. So when it comes to systems, the way we define it you can see it's on the first slide, is that the government has put in place some kind of a systematized or permanent procedures in place where government is planning, approving, and allocating and monitoring public expenditures in a way that these expenditures are benefiting both men and women. So that was the idea behind having this kind of indicator, so that we know for sure that public spending and public investments that are made by the government are benefiting both men and women. And we have some examples in terms of what would entail these systems, especially from the work that we've been doing on GRV. So we have worked with the governments in terms of developing, say, gender budget statements, budget classifiers, and gender markers. So those are some of the examples of what a system looks like that tracks allocations for gender equality. And in most cases, these kind of systems are overseen and led by the Ministries of Finance within the budget department. So that makes it central as a unit, which not only makes an effort to making sure that there's a systematic way of monitoring allocations, but also because it's led by Ministries of Finance, so we want to make sure there's ownership, the reliability of data, and also the use of data for policy making. And the other definition that I have on the slide is how do we define allocations for gender equality? There are three levels of definitions. Firstly, if the public spending is targeting only women and girls, so that's direct allocations. If the spending is targeting both men and women, but gender equality is the specific objective. And the third one is if gender equality is included as a mainstream objective. So that's the indirect allocations. So moving to the next slide, some background and the objectives of the indicator. As I said earlier, the indicator measures government efforts to track and make public allocations for gender equality. So the incentives that we have in terms of developing this indicator was making sure that we have the data in place which is disaggregated by sex. So this is also one of the areas which is very difficult even now for us to have very reliable information in terms of how much of public spending is targeted for gender equality. It's very difficult for us to track and monitor. So the incentive behind this indicator was that we would generate that kind of data and information very regularly. And then the second related objective was to make sure that we use this data to inform gender equitable decisions and policies. And thirdly, that public expenditures are, as I said earlier as well, that they benefit both women and men equally. And then obviously with the background, this indicator comes from the Busan Commitment, which commits that the need to accelerate and deepen effort to collect, disseminate, harmonize, and make full use of this data to inform policies. So that was the background in terms of where the indicator comes from. I will move to the next slide, which is going into the methodology of how we measure this indicator. There are 4 criteria that we use. The first one is that if there is a government official statement on such a system for tracking gender equality allocation. The second criteria is that whether allocations for gender equality are tracked systematically. The third one is whether there's a leadership and oversight of this system at the central level. And the fourth one, which is related to the transparency side of public allocations, is whether whether the information on gender equality allocations are made public through, for example, parliamentary oversight and CSO mechanisms. So for countries to qualify whether such systems exist or not, one of the first 3 criteria have to be in place to make sure that such a system to track gender equality allocations exists at the country level. The fourth criteria, if it's also selected, means that the governments not only track gender equality allocation, but they also make it public. So this is how we are measuring the indicators now. We have also asked governments, I'm going to the next slide, because from the work, as I said, on GRB, we also know that many countries have put in place system, but they also go to the next level of like using gender equality indicators and gender sex desegregated data to inform budget allocations. So for qualitative information purposes, we also ask countries whether they are making such efforts. And then not only gender equality allocations are important, but also whether they're spent properly and whether there has been an impact. So the next question, the next piece of information that we ask is to add information whether the government conducts regular impact assessments of budgets and expenditures. So for the next slide, I just want to give you a brief overview from findings from the first round of monitoring. This was the first time we are doing it, and based on the work that we've been doing on GRB for the last many years, we already had many countries who have been doing this work. So it was what we found in 2013 was that out of the 35 reporting countries, we had at least 12 countries which reported that they have a system in place. Out of the 12 countries, there were 5 additional countries which said that they tracked gender equality allocations, but those allocations were not made public. So in total, we had 12 countries which not only allocate gender equality allocations, so track gender equality allocations, but they also make them public, means there's a transparency element was included there as well. So we are very excited about the second round because we know that there's many more countries which are reporting this year. So we're hoping that we would have some more countries which we know for sure that they have been working on putting in place these accountability mechanisms, that they would be able to report this year. So I would be happy to take any questions that you may have. Thanks so much.
Okay, so thank you for the presentation. We do have the hand raised of Khalid Mansour. So Khalid, I will unmute you and please go ahead and ask your question. Maybe introduce yourself again. We remember you from the last session, but maybe you can introduce yourself one more time, please.
Thanks. Good evening and good morning to everybody. I'm Khalid Mansour. I'm working with the Danish Rep office in Ramallah. I'm theoretically the focal point for Denmark as a provider. I have a question. It's this indicator about public expenditure and allocation is very, very important, and it's interesting for Palestine, because Palestine has what they call gender responsive budget policy whatsoever. It's published, it's there. But the real challenge is the government public budget transparency. It's not transparent in terms of reporting, and this is one of the main problems to assess the PA or Palestine state public expenditure. And also we have another problem, which is lack of checks and balances. And take, for example, we don't have a functional legislative council. So the country will report, of course, whatever they want to report, and there is no checks and balances. Just I wanted to highlight this. And I heard you and women mentioning having a system of 6 disaggregated expenditure on the data, and this is a very challenging thing. And I think there's a huge space here to work with the government to improve its production of credible 6 disaggregated data. Thanks a lot. That's all. Hello?
Hi, Khalid. Thanks so much for your note. I completely agree because in Palestine we've been working for last 3 years on GRB, so I know the challenges very well there, especially when it comes to on budget transparency and accountability. What I can mention is that one of the things that we've been trying to do in Palestine in terms of at least moving things forward on this area was to work with the existing aid management system that you have in place. Our UN Women office had been working with the Ministry of Finance, but also the Development Corporation focal points there to making sure that there's some indicators on gender equality are included in there. So some kind of gender markers have been established so far. I mean, it's still work in progress, but this is something that we've been pushing there for last few years now.
Okay, so thank you. I think that covers the questions for the moment. Just to remind you, you can always raise your hand or type the question if you have any questions throughout the presentation. So that covers indicator 8. We're now going to cover another indicator that is sourced on globally available data. And you'll see that this data specifically comes from the creditor reporting system from the OECD. So right now we're going to talk about this indicator that's called aid untied, and we're looking at the percentage of aid that is provided that is fully untied. Okay, a baseline was made in 2010, and we're looking at continued progress over time for this indicator. Okay, so some definitions. What does tied aid mean? Aid that is tied means that there are restrictions given on the aid basically that the goods and services that are purchased using this aid have to come from a certain, from a restricted number of countries geographically, okay? So an example of this is that a provider gives aid or provides aid, but says that the goods and services purchased with this aid must be purchased from the provider company itself, or provider country itself. So this is what tied aid means. There's also like a subset of this broader definition that you can call partially tied aid, and this is where the procurement is open to a broader set of restricted countries, but nonetheless, this procurement is restricted, okay? So one side note is that we are not including multilateral ODA when we're talking about the tied aid, as multilateral ODA in general is treated as untied, and this is a convention that has been set up. So we're talking about bilateral ODA when we're looking at tied versus untied. Okay. Okay. So what kind of how did the commitments about tied versus untied aid originate? There was this 2001 DAC recommendation of untying aid to the least developed countries, and then in 2008, this was also extended to what is it?
To cover the high indebted poor countries.
Yeah. So this was also extended to the HPIC category itself is the to other the other poor country classification. Okay. So it was taken from the least developed countries and also extended to this HPIC category. Okay. So why is tied versus untied aid important? Basically, untied aid is seen as more cost-effective. And there are estimates that suggest that there's a loss of 15 to 30% of value in money when aid is tied. On the other hand, when there's freedom to choose the country or where the goods and services come from, let's say that they can be purchased at a better market rate, and there is not this loss of value for untied aid. Also, untying aid allows recipients of development cooperation to develop domestic markets and to strengthen systems within the country itself. Okay, so these commitments both come from Accra and Busan, and a side note is that this recommendation covers most forms of ODA, but it does exclude freestanding technical cooperation and also food aid. So these are kind of not included in this classification of untied versus untied aid. Okay, so we're measuring progress in untying aid by looking at bilateral providers because, as I said before, multilateral development cooperation assistance is not included in this classification that we're looking at. Okay. This methodology for classifying untied aid comes from the OECD DAC, or Development Assistance Committee, and again, focusing on bilateral providers. And it's within the OECD Development Assistance Committee Secretariat that these calculations are done and that the estimates are made. One thing I wanted to say in terms of measurement is that in the past, non-reporting was quite an issue. You had, for many countries, they would not report on the tying status of the aid that they provided. However, over time, this has improved so much so that in 2012, only 3.5% of ODA was not given a classification in terms of tying status. So reporting is virtually no longer an issue, and it's always getting better for tying status. Oh, the HIPC is highly indebted poor countries, it came to me. So for the classification, the coverage of the indicator originally had to do just with least developed countries, and then it was extended to highly indebted poor countries. Okay. So those are kind of the issues of the measurement, and it's done within the OECD DAC itself, and non-reporting is no longer a big issue. So we can look at kind of trends over time that have taken place for tying status. So there has been significant progress over time. The untied status has progressed from 24% in 2006 to 78% in 2012. Now the share of untied aid going to least developed countries is almost fully untied. So there was a goal that was also set by the Development Assistance Committee when they decided and made this commitment to track the tying status of aid. And there's this goal of 60% of share of ODA, originally just to least developed countries and then extended to highly indebted poor countries, should be untied. So if you look at this figure, we can see that we have total bilateral ODA here with this solid blue line, the share of untied aid under the recommendation, and also the share untied in total bilateral ODA, so not just going to least developed countries. So you can see that the share of untied aid under the recommendation going to least developed countries and highly indebted poor countries at the aggregate level has remained virtually always above this threshold of 60% of the goal that was made during these commitments, except for this drop here in 2008. Nonetheless, there was like this peak around 2009 and then a general decline, and now we are again improving from this dip in the trajectory of untied aid. So like I said, just to note that at the aggregate level, it does hide some differences. For example, there are some countries such as Korea and Portugal that are below this goal of 60% of untying aid to LDCs and highly indebted poor countries. And there are others such as the USA and New Zealand that are getting close to it. So they're still above this 60% goal, but they have been decreasing and almost approaching that limit or threshold of 60%. I wanted to say some other things, that the work on untying aid here in the OECD is an ongoing work, and there are future updates that will be made to this indicator. One is the idea of updating this threshold, because in general countries are well above this threshold and they have remained so for a long period of time. So there's this idea of making this threshold much higher, instead of 60%, even up to 90, 95% for untying aid to least developed countries and highly indebted poor countries. Also, this only includes DAC countries with bilateral aid. So there is the idea of extending this to non-DAC donors, because there are some cases of non-DAC donors that actually tie a lot of their aid. And so you would want to include them also in this monitoring. Lastly, the thing I wanted to say about the private sector is, now that the private sector has for some time gained importance or recognition in terms of development cooperation, there's a little bit of a worry that including the private sector in development could mean more aid being tied, in the sense that if you create an enabling environment for the private sector that somehow favors the provider country, this is in a sense tying aid to goods and services from the provider country itself. So I kind of flew through, or at least talked quickly about the different slides. I don't know if any of my colleagues have something to add.
I think I would just remind that the data for this indicator is not collected at country level. We have already said that, but I think it's useful to refresh that this is collected here at the OECD, and so the data will not be coming from the country.
Right. So thank you. And I think we have at least something.
Yeah, we have one raised hand from Khaled Mansour.
Okay, so is he on? Is he? Oh, yeah. Okay, so Mr. Mansour, I will unmute you again if you want to ask your question. Okay.
Thanks a lot. I know this is not collected at the country level, but I have two verification questions. What about in-kind aid? I know you mentioned food is not included, and what about technical assistant, because it's also part of the official development aid. What I'm trying to ask, is there more operational definition for this issue? Thanks a lot. Thanks. I finished.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mansour, for your question. Yeah, so like you said, in-kind or food aid in the moment is not included in the definition. For the technical assistance part, basically it's that humanitarian aid is not included uh, in the part that's included for tying status. So I hope this answers your question.
Maybe Mr. Mansour had also the point of it. There is some kind of technical assistance which is almost in-kind services of an expert from one government going to the other, and of course this aid is completely tied in the sense that is the expert from maybe the partner government going to these other governments to provide guidance on how to implement some reform, etc. And in that case, it is not accounted for, but is of course a technical assistance. This indicator is looking more at the financial flows, and what are the conditionalities in terms of the purchase of goods and services that are associated to those flows. I hope we answered the question. Louder. Yeah.
So we have no other questions, no hands raised. If you still want to ask your question, you can raise your hand or you can type it. So the materials, the presentations have been uploaded into the handout section in your menu, and we will also be circulating it in a few days together with the recording of this webinar.
Yes, so the recordings will be available in between Monday and Tuesday in the website of the Global Partnership for the Community, the Line Community website, which is unteamworks.org /GPEDC. And you'll find there both the videos and the presentations in both English, Spanish, and French. So we thank you for participating in these 3 webinars this week. This was the last one. We will continue to support other participants. There is another one scheduled for next week to cater those participants from the Asia and Pacific regions, which are often not available at this time of the day. But everybody is also welcome to those webinars as well. Thank you very much for your participation.
So.